You know what one of those things that we do in polite society is that I've always found to be sometimes awkward. In fact, it probably has resulted in more awkward moments in our lives than just about anything. It is holding the door open for someone else. You know, when you're walking through a door, you walk through a door and then you want to hold the door open for someone else. Now, most people will do this. They'll come through a door, and if there's someone close by, they'll hold it open so that you can come in. And then the person who's coming through the door, if they're polite, what they will do is they'll actually grab the door from you, or they'll hold the door, kind of signifying that they're taking over, and they might even say thank you or whisper a thank you or a smile, giving permission to the person who was holding it for them to go. Like it's releasing you of any further duty of having to hold the door open. But listen, one of the things that we know is that it doesn't always happen the way we expect it's going to happen. It's hardly ever smooth. And I've discovered as I was thinking about this series, I was thinking about how many of these door-holding faux pas that I've experienced, that probably you have experienced too over the years. And so maybe as you've experienced them and as I have, I started to think about what are these things that commonly happen to us whenever we go and someone is holding the door. I've discovered a few of them. I've even given them names. Like the first one is the cross body hold. Have you ever done that? Or had somebody do that? They're holding the door open for you, but they're holding it like this so that they have to now cross over your arm in order to get through. And so what do? Put them here, then you hold this here. I mean, it's just awkward. Right? There's another one that I call the inside squeeze. Now that's the one where the door swings inward and the person is here holding the door open for you. The only problem is their body is covering the opening of the door. And so now you're having to squish through the door opening with that person there. The one I like the most is the early release. You know this one? Where they're holding the door open and then they're just like slowly walking away. And then just as you're about to get there, that's when they let go. And so now you have to catch the door or just let it close on you. Have you ever expected that? Oh, you know what's even better? The far away, right? The far away hold. You're like 30 feet away. Like you just closed the door on your car. You just clicked your remote. And now the guy is holding the door. And you feel like you have to run practically over there because he's holding the door even though you're so far away. I've even discovered a couple of them that happen when you're the one who's holding the door open. Do you know the doorman? Where you come through and you hold the door open for the guy behind you, and then the people just keep coming, like there's 30 people that come and no one is taking over holding the door, so you're just kind of there holding the door for everybody? Or the door stop. That's the other one. The door stop. Where you're holding the door and the person comes through and just like you're a doorstop, just walk by. No acknowledgement, no smile, no thank you, just like this is your job, that's what you're supposed to do. We get into a lot of these awkward situations, and yet we still hold the door open for people. Now, have you ever thought about why is it that we hold the door open for other people? Well, actually, it's pretty simple, right? We hold the door open to show people that they are welcome and to make it easier to come in. We want it to be easier for them to come in, to come through. The problem for us, especially for us as a church, is that a lot of people will never come to a church because church people have a bad habit of making it hard to walk through that door, making it hard for people to come through. I heard this story. This is a story that I heard from someone who experienced it firsthand of a church that spent a lot of time and a lot of money going into a very, very poor area in another country. And they spent a lot of time there doing Bible studies. And at the end of it, they baptized a lot of people. And the following weekend, all of those people went to the church where the people who had come in were from, where the church people were from. And when they got to the church, the person at the door said, "I'm sorry, you can't come in here. You're not dressed properly." Now listen, I'm worried that this kind of thing happens all over the world. I know that it happens here. I've been to churches where when someone walks in and they're not dressed properly, or they're dressed a certain way, they weren't dressed the way they were expected to dress, and people just stared at them. They would avoid them or even ignore them, right? And it's not just how you're dressed, right? When I was living down south, and for those of you who are watching us outside of California, I don't mean in the South, but I mean in Southern California, down south. I was living there for a while, and there was this one church I went to. I went to the same church for months, almost a year, same church. In the entire time I was there, no one ever came up to me. No one ever said hello. Nothing. No one introduced themselves to me. I left that church not knowing a single person, not knowing anyone that I knew when I started going there. See, it's not only what happens on the inside. It's also doing what we can to make it easy for people to get inside, right? For some churches, it's literally, how do you get inside? I've been to churches where they keep the doors locked during the service. Like you get there 5 minutes late and you're like, because the door is locked. I went to a church for many years. The church had 19 glass doors all around the building, no sign that said which of them was the door to get in. There's no sign that said, go to this door. And they didn't keep all of the doors unlocked. There was only one door that was unlocked. Good luck trying to find it. There are other churches where you wouldn't even know that there was a church there. There was no signage. There's no doors. There's no apparent way to get in. Unless you really stopped and looked around, you wouldn't even know it was a church. Listen, I don't think people do this kind of stuff on purpose. I really don't. At least for most people, I don't think they do this. But for most of us, we just don't think about what is it that we can do to make it easier for people to come through the doors of our church, to come through an open door, or to hold the door open. Do you know that one of the top fears of people is when it comes to coming to a new church for the first time? It's having to ask somebody where the bathroom is. Isn't that crazy? And that's why here we have signs pointing people to the restrooms, because we don't want anyone to have to feel awkward that they have to ask somebody when they're new. Right? We have signs on the outside to show people where to come in, because our church is on the corner of Miller and Spruce, and though our address is on Miller, the entrance is on Spruce. And so we want to make sure to do whatever it is that we can to make it easy for people to come through, to come into the door. We want to hold the door open for them. And so today we're starting a brand new series called Holding the Door Open. And what I want to do over these next few weeks, for me and the others who will be speaking on this series, I want us to set out a case for why it's critical for us to hold the door open for people and to make it as easy as possible for them to come through and to meet Jesus. And I want to start today by reminding us, you and me, those of you who are followers of Jesus, reminding us that inviting people to come sit with you at church, to come sit with you at a trivia night that the church is hosting, or at our church picnic, which is coming up in October, or at Christmas, which is coming up at Christmas. That the reason that we do that is not just because it's something we can do or should do, but it's actually something that Jesus trusted you and me to do. He trusted you and me to hold the door open, to invite people to come in, to come through, and to meet him. And listen, if you're watching us today, and I don't know why you're watching us today, but if you're watching us today and you're not a Christian, welcome. We're glad that you're here. And listen, I don't know why you decided to be here today, why you're watching us. If you're watching us online, you may be sitting next to somebody who is watching us and you can't get away. Maybe somebody guilted you into watching today, or someone bribed you or threatened you. But listen, I don't know why it is that you are spending time with us today. I'm really glad that you are. But there is one thing I know for sure, especially for those of you who are here with us live today. You're here today because someone invited you to come here. About 2,000 years ago, a little over 2,000 years ago, there was a man. His name was Matthew. Matthew was one of Jesus's closest friends and one of his followers. He was one of Jesus's first disciples. And Matthew would write down an account of everything that he knew and he experienced in Jesus's life. And that manuscript that he wrote was actually bound together as a book, and it has survived through to today. It's the book that that is known as the Gospel according to Matthew. And in the 28th chapter of that book that he wrote that tells us his story, his version, his perspective of the life of Jesus, Matthew tells us about Jesus's final instructions to his disciples. So let me give you, for time reference, this is where we are. Just a few days earlier, Jesus was betrayed by Judas, one of his disciples. He was unjustly convicted. He was beaten to within an inch of his life, and then he was crucified on a cross where he died. He was buried in a tomb, and everyone, even his family and his closest followers, thought that he was dead and gone. And they thought that the movement that he had started, the movement that was just starting to pick up steam, they all thought that died too. But then on the third day, Jesus walked out of the tomb, and the first people that he ran into were some of the ladies that were his followers. And then he met the disciples, the 11 guys now, because Judas wasn't there anymore. He met those guys, and then crowds of people. These whole groups of people, all these people who saw Jesus, they saw him die, and then they saw him alive again. And no one expected Jesus to be alive again. In fact, when he went to see his disciples, when they saw him for the first time after he had died and rose again, at first they didn't even recognize him. He was cooking them breakfast. They weren't sure who this guy was. And so Jesus is talking to them, and he tells them, listen, I need you to go meet me at a mountain spot. I guess Jesus had something else that he had to do, but he still wanted to talk to them. So he tells them to go, and we're going to meet later. And this is how Matthew describes what happens. Matthew says, then the 11 disciples left for Galilee, going to the mountain where Jesus had told them to go. Now, Scripture doesn't specifically tell us. Matthew doesn't write down exactly where that point is that Jesus told them to go, but it was probably a place where they usually hung out. You know, like if you tell one of your friends and you say, hey, let's have lunch at the place next week. Like, you probably already know, if your friend says the place, what they're talking about, because you've probably been there before, or you had been talking about it. It was just like everybody understands what that is. Well, that's probably a place that they had been to many times before, because Jesus says, go to that mountain spot, go to that place on the mountain. And everybody's like, okay, yeah, we know. And that's where they meet. And when they get there, the disciples, just shortly after that, Jesus comes. And Matthew says that when they saw him, Jesus, when they saw him, they worshiped him. They worshiped him, of course. They worshiped him. But then listen to what Matthew says. He says, but some of them doubted. Now, when we read this and we think some of them doubted, we think that, doubted, that means some of them just didn't believe, right? They doubted that this was really Jesus. But the word that is translated into doubted here is the Greek word distazo. And distazo does not mean unbelief. Distazo means a state of hesitancy or uncertainty. Not, I don't believe you, more of, whoa, I'm not sure I should come near, or I'm not sure what to do about this, right? And who could blame them? Some of them were probably thinking, man, this is too good to be true. And you know what your mama says about things that are too good to be true. So they're like, hold on a second, is this really real? Some of them may have been hesitant because of how they behaved when Jesus was being tried, what they thought when Jesus was being crucified, how they responded, and how they gave up after Jesus died. But even with this hesitancy and this uncertainty, they all worshiped Jesus because they all recognized now that he was who he said he was. Matthew goes on, he writes, Jesus came and told his disciples, listen to what he says. He says, I have been given all authority in heaven and on earth. So Jesus is now laying the groundwork for what he is about to say next, right? He's making sure that they all understand that what he is about to say to them carries all the authority of heaven and earth. Listen, if he's talking about heaven and earth, he's talking about everywhere, right? It's like me saying, I am the best looking guy in this building and outside of this building. Like, where else is there? There is nowhere else. And Jesus is saying, I've been given all authority here and everywhere else, right? All that authority, he says, I've got. He's giving them authority, reminding them that his authority is the authority. There's no other authority that is greater than his. There's no other authority that can contradict his. And then listen to what he says. He says, therefore, or because of what I just said, because of this authority that I have. He says, therefore, Jesus says, go. He says, go, not wait. He says, go. Not build a church and sit in it and hope people will come. Jesus says, go, right? He's pretty clear. He says, therefore, go, and he says, and make disciples. So first we know we have to go. And then, what do we do when we go? We make disciples. Disciples aren't found. Disciples aren't grown, right? You don't plant a seed and then a disciple just magically grows. Disciples are made. And Jesus says, I want you to make disciples. I don't want you to make converts. I don't want you to make supporters. I don't want you to make Catholics or Baptists or Adventists. Jesus says, go make disciples. Hey, listen, there's nothing wrong with being Catholic or a Baptist or an Adventist or any other denomination or Christian group. What I'm saying is that being a part of that group isn't what Jesus said for us to do. He said for us to make disciples. And disciples is just a fancy word for students. It's a fancy word for a person who wants to learn. And we all know that we learn best not by reading, though we do learn by reading, not by hearing, listening to people talk, though we do learn by that, but we learn best by doing, right? We learn best when we're hands-on actually doing what it is we're trying to learn. And as followers of Jesus, we learn to be disciples best when we do life with each other, when we live our lives together. Disciples are made through the process of living life together. Jesus says, therefore, go and make disciples, and he says, of all the nations. All the nations. There's no exceptions. We have to go everywhere to everyone. It's weird because in that day, you had to go to the nations. But if you live here in the San Francisco Bay Area, if you live in a large metropolitan city, in fact, these days, even if you live in smaller cities, small towns, the world is coming to us. The world is coming to us. And Jesus says you have to go and make disciples of all nations. And he says, baptizing them. And listen to what he says, in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. Now, I just want to point this out. Baptizing is important. I don't want to gloss over that, right? Baptizing is like the tripwire. That's what starts the process. But listen, Jesus doesn't say in the names of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. He says in the name, one name, right? He doesn't say in the name of the Father and in the name of the Son and in the name of the Holy Spirit. He's not talking about three separate gods. He's talking about one God. And experiencing God in three persons is actually an essential element of being made into a disciple. Jesus says, teach these new commandments, teach these new disciples to obey all the commands I have given you. See, up until now, Jesus was the teacher, right? Everybody was following. Jesus was the teacher. And now he was passing on to them the responsibility to teach. And as they pass on that responsibility, he passes it on to them, they pass it on to the next group, and they pass it on to the next group. And now someone has passed it on to us. It's now our responsibility to teach. And how do we teach? We teach the same way Jesus did. Not just in a classroom, though sometimes Jesus did teach in a classroom setting, right? Not just in a sermon, though Jesus often taught and spoke in sermons. But the way that Jesus taught most often, and the way that he taught that had the biggest impact on people, on their lives, was simply by living life with people and then addressing the life issues that they experienced as they lived their day-to-day life. That's how Jesus taught best. That's what you and I are called to do. He says, teach these new disciples, and then he says to obey all the commands that I have given you. And a lot of times, when I hear obey and I hear commands and put them together and I read that and I think, oh, he must mean obey all of the 10 commandments, right? Because that's like what comes to me. I don't know what comes to you right away. For me, when he says obey all the commands, I'm thinking, okay, he's saying obey the 10 commandments. That's what he's trying to say, right? Or maybe he means obey the 612 commands, right? Because at that time, one of the things that we know is that the Jewish people had the big 10, right? And then they had actually a whole bunch of other, total 612 commands, the other commands to kind of help us stay away from being in a position to break the big 10. Or maybe Jesus is saying that you have to obey everything that I've said. And it's a good thing that these guys have been writing down all of the things that I've said, because now you have to obey them. Now, here's the problem with thinking that way. We think to be a disciple, you have to obey the commands. And you have to obey all of them. Whether it's the 10 or the 612 or everything that Jesus ever said, you have to obey them all. And listen, since there's no way in HE double hockey sticks that I am ever going to be able to keep all of the commands, right? Shoot, I don't even know if I can really properly keep even one of the commands. If that is what a disciple is, someone who obeys all the commands, and I could never obey all the commands, then I must not be a disciple. And listen, if I have to obey all the commands, I could never be a disciple. But that word that is translated obey is the Greek word tereo, which doesn't mean to obey the way that we think obey, right? It's actually better translated as observe, like we observe Labor Day as a holiday. So now let's look again at what Jesus says. He says, you teach these new disciples, these new students, these new learners, these people who want to learn, right? He doesn't say teach these guys and girls so that they will become disciples, right? He calls them disciples already. He says that once you start learning, you're already a disciple. My son has been applying to graduate schools and he's been sending out applications. They do it all online now. It's really a crazy thing because I was writing out in paper when I was applying for school, and now it's just all online. But listen, think about this. Does applying, when he turns in that application, does applying to the school make him a student? No, right? He just got his first acceptance letter. Does getting that acceptance letter make him a student? No. But when he registers for classes and he purchases his textbooks and he attends that first class, sits down there and he's right there taking his seat in the classroom, is he a student now? Absolutely. So what's the difference? It's his actions, right? By his actions, he has shown that he is ready to learn from his teacher. That is what a student is. And so people, you and I, we become disciples when we show that we are ready to learn from our teacher. Does it mean that on that first day that we become a student, that we 100% have everything down, that we know everything already? Absolutely not. In fact, you're going to finish that teacher's class and you still don't know everything. You're going to take another class to learn more. The learning part never ends. You're always going to be a student. We teach them to obey, to follow, to observe. We teach all the commands, right? We teach everything. We go through the scriptures and we want to know and understand everything that Jesus said. Everything that Jesus tells us is, this is what we need to do in order to live the best life that we can live. We want to know what they all are, but as a student, we're not going to get it perfect. We're not going to get it right. We don't have to do everything perfect. To be a disciple, we have to decide that we want to learn, and we become a disciple. We become disciples when we show that we're ready to learn from our teacher. For most people, that first step to discipleship, that act of registering for classes and then buying your textbooks and then going and sitting in the classroom, that pretty much is a public declaration when you put it on the official record that you're registering for class. When you go to the student store and everybody sees you purchasing textbooks, when you walk into that classroom and sit down on that chair, everybody knows you're a student in that class. And as a follower of Jesus, how we become a disciple, our steps is usually baptism. Baptism is that public declaration that we're putting our faith and trust in Jesus, that we want to learn from Jesus. And by extension, that we are willing to learn from those that Jesus trusted to teach. And if you're a follower of Jesus, that is you and that is me. So you don't need a degree. You don't need to have gone to Bible school. You don't need to have scoured the scriptures and be an expert on the Bible. If you have experienced enough, know enough, that you were able to make a decision to follow Jesus, then you know enough to talk to somebody else, to give them an opportunity to be a follower of Jesus. This is how Jesus closes it out. He says, and be sure of this, I am with you always, even to the end of the age. He says, you never have to doubt this. All right? He says, never doubt that I'm always with you. And it's interesting because the word translated as always is used differently here than it is used in any other place in the New Testament, that Greek word. Everywhere else, it's used differently, but here, that word always is literally translated the whole of the day. Every part of the day, all of them together, the whole of your day, he's there. So, Jesus is saying, don't worry, I am with you in the whole of your day. I am with you in every moment of every day until the end of this age. I am with you in every moment. I am with you when you're sleeping. I am with you when you wake up. I am with you when you have that first conversation with your spouse. I am with you when you have that first conversation with your children. I am with you when you have that first conversation at work. I am with you every single moment of every day up until that last moment of that day. Jesus says, I'm with you every moment of every day. See, the ministry and the mission and the movement that Jesus started is something so important that Jesus knew that he could only trust his disciples, his students, his learners to carry it on. And if you are a follower of Jesus, then Jesus is trusting you to carry on his mission. He is trusting you to hold the door open and invite others to come in. Think about who he started with, right? Because sometimes I think we'll think, well, I'm not really qualified, and there's a lot of other people here at church. Let them do it, because I'm not ready. Sometimes really what we're thinking, and we just don't want to say it, is, I'm not worthy. But he gave this imperative to invite to one of his students, Peter. Shoot first, then aim, Peter. Act before you think, Peter. Rash and unpredictable, Peter, Jesus called him. He gave it to John, who got so frustrated with people that he was always wanting to call fire down from heaven to just burn them all up. Jesus called John. He gave this imperative to Philip, a man who spent so much time with Jesus while he was in his active ministry here, and still, at the end of it, didn't feel like he really knew who Jesus was. Jesus gave it to Philip. He gave it to Thomas, whose faith was so small, so tiny, that even after seeing the resurrected Jesus, talking to the resurrected Jesus, seeing him walking around, talking to people, just like nothing had ever changed, that wasn't enough. He needed to actually put his finger through the holes in Jesus' hand before he would believe. These are the guys that Jesus says, I'm leaving you with the responsibility for this movement. I want you to take responsibility for spreading my message, to sharing my message with the people who've never heard of me, who don't believe in me, who've told lies about me. Go into all of the world. Go. Because what Jesus would tell you is that it's not about the goodness in you, it's about the goodness in him. It's not about the power in you, but it's about the faith that is in you. And all you need is faith. Scripture says that it's the faith the size of a mustard seed. A lot of us don't get that. So let me put it into something you'll understand better, something you probably see on a regular basis. It's the faith the size of a fingernail clipping. That's it. Jesus says, that's all the faith you need. And if you'll give that faith to me, watch what I can do with it. Which brings us back to our door. And why we hold the door open for people. Right? We said we hold the door open for people to make it easier for people to come through. Do you know what an open door is? Do you know what it is when we hold a door open for somebody else? It's an invitation. Right? When you step to the side and hold the door open, you've got a smile on your face, the person is walking by. It is an invitation for them to come in. Do people come in through a closed door? Sure. Maybe if there are big signs pointing to the door or signs on the door. But when a person holds the door open, that is the most powerful invitation for someone to come through. When you hold the door open, you're giving someone an opportunity to meet Jesus. And that's why we say that this invitation is imperative. Because church has gotten such a bad rap over the years. And look, it's mostly because of our own doing, I'll admit it. We've gotten a bad rap because of people like me standing on stages like this. We get a bad rap because of Christians like us who we know aren't perfect and we do make mistakes. Because of us, a lot of people just don't feel welcomed at all. So it's up to us to hold the door open and to make the invitation. Because you don't know what hangs in the balance of your decision to extend that invitation and hold that door open to make it easier for the next person to come through. Over the next few weeks, we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about what we can do to make those invitations easier and more natural. We're going to talk about the joy that comes from making those invitations and watching someone accept that invitation. We're going to give you the tools to relieve that pressure that sometimes we have so that it makes it easier to make those invitations. And we're going to be putting together a message series after this series, specifically designed to address the questions that people on the other side of the door have about religion, about faith, and about Jesus. But none of that will make any difference without you. Jesus trusted you to share his message with the people that are in your world. And all you have to do is hold the door.
Thank you for joining us for this week's message. Gracepoint Church is located in South San Francisco, California. For additional content or to find out more information about Gracepoint Church, visit us online at wearegracepoint.com.